just the first image is to remind you that the first news of cultural destruction that we had from the Iraq War really came right at the beginning, because soon after the fall of Baghdad to US troops on April 9th, 2003, the museums and the libraries of the country were looted and destroyed. And I know that most of you know this, but I'm just reminding you when we can begin to think about the destruction that happened in the war. So most people are aware of what happened with the looting of the Iraq Museum, especially because that received so much attention in the press, in the media. And this is a flyer that was being used by US Customs and the FBI to try to track down objects that were stolen from the museum, because immediately after the theft, a great outcry emerged in all the world that this was a great loss of world cultural heritage and that something should be done to find it. So this was one of a number of posters and flyers that they actually started, that the US started to hand out in order to try to track down the missing pieces, because everybody realized, even the actual US military realized, that this was really a major embarrassment that such a thing should happen. The flyers, of course, interesting because they point to some of the major objects and they list them here. Some of these have been found already, such as the head on the left. Actually, that one has been found too. This one was found in the United States, in case somebody ever says to you, well, these things don't travel, but they clearly do travel, because that poor Sumerian king made it all the way to the United States. Perhaps the most famous object that was looted in the museum looting was this head of a goddess from Uruk from about 3200 BC, made out of alabaster. It's probably the first really identifiable image of a goddess whose name we know, Inanna, found in a temple precinct. Luckily, this head was found. It was lost, and it was really devastating to hear that it was lost, because it's so important to many of us who grew up studying it and being familiar with it. So when it was lost, we were horrified, but luckily it was found a few months afterwards. When these objects were lost, now to get to the real point here, when these objects were lost from the museum, they were lamented everywhere as a terrible loss for global cultural heritage. We heard a lot about that in the media, that this was not just a loss for Iraq, but it was really a loss for the entire world. And I think that this is true. Ancient Mesopotamia is global cultural heritage, and it was a tremendous loss. The destruction of cultural heritage in Iraq is certainly a tremendous loss for people everywhere in the world, not just for Iraqis. But what I'd like to do today is to turn that around a little bit, because I told you that I think there are issues that haven't been covered adequately, that we haven't thought about adequately, as either as scholars and archaeologists or as people who are interested in our cultural heritage. And I think that one issue we should think about is this, that the idea of global cultural heritage is in some ways a two-edged sword, because on the one hand, it is good for raising public awareness and that people realize that this is such a major loss. But then on the other hand, by continuing to focus on this as global cultural heritage, what we do is we tend to forget the major point that cultural heritage is understood locally in a very specific way. There are local relationships to history and to culture that are different from the global ones. And both of them need to be taken into account, not just the global aspect, because people locally will relate differently to their history and to their cultural heritage. And I'd like to think about that a little bit today. I'm sorry. So what happened when the museum was looted is that soon people started to focus on the exact numbers. We heard a lot of discussion about how many numbers were actually lost. There was a great deal of tallying. Some people said it was this many thousands, others said it was that many thousands. And to be honest, I'm simply not interested in those numbers. I think making those kinds of tallies is, I mean, if you'd like in the discussion, I'll give you the numbers that we have, but I think that that distracts from the real issues at hand. And so I'd rather not start concentrating on counting numbers. In any case, we can't know how many things have been lost because no inventory has been completed yet, because there isn't enough equipment in the museum, there isn't enough museum staff. So what I'd like to think about a little bit more is the local relationship of people to the past, as well as the global relationship, and these two aspects. And I also want to think about the issue of the relationship of politics and archaeology, or the relationship of war and archaeology, which is not something that's new. And perhaps if you're not an archaeologist or a historian, you're not really as aware of it as I might be. But of course, since the first days of the rise of the discipline of archaeology in the 19th century, the modern discipline of archaeology as we know it today, since the beginning, archaeology and empire have been very closely linked. And if you go to look at Mesopotamian works of art in the British Museum, then you know very well, and it's perfectly clear, that most of those objects came to Britain in the mid-19th century, and most of them were actually brought to London by this man who stands on the top of the Assyrian palace, and his name is Sir Austen Henry Layard, and he was this great adventurer who went to Iraq, and he started excavating and bringing back objects to Britain. At the same time, Paul-Émile Botta was also excavating and taking objects to the Louvre Museum, and their letters back and forth were very clear about it. They were saying that we want to bring back artifacts to the center of the empire. It was about whether Paris or London was going to have the better collection brought to the center of the empire. So they didn't sort of try to hide it or feel embarrassed about it. They were very upfront about the idea that these were artifacts that should be brought to the center of the empire. And this is what happened in the 19th century. And then after some time, during the period of the British Mandate, what happened was we had the British occupation in Iraq. This is a British postcard from 1917. So really right when the British first took over the country, officially under the mandate. And you can see that the postcard is dotted with the main ancient sites. So this was the vision that the British in the days of the mandate had of Mesopotamia, of Iraq, that it was identified for them as was, part of the knowledge of this land, that it was made up of these historical sites. It was the identity of the land. There's no question that the historical sites made up this kind of terrain, which was the identity of the land. So we speak a lot about petroleum and so on, but there is absolutely no question that the ancient sites, the historical sites, are part of the identity of this land, whether it's the locals who view it that way, or whether it's occupation armies in the past, or imperial powers in the past or today.